The morning began like any typical summer weekend. The backyard buzzed with activity as Jaden and his friends splashed around in the pool, their laughter filling the air. Madeline stood by the outdoor bar, her hair catching the sunlight as she poured margaritas for the group. Anthony watched from the kitchen window, arms folded, a gentle smile on his face. It seemed perfect: his son, his wife, their home, but that nagging feeling in his gut lingered. "Anthony, come join us," Madeline called, her voice breaking through the noise. She waved a margarita in the air, grinning as she motioned for him to come outside. "I'll be right out," he replied, trying to keep his tone upbeat. He glanced at his phone on the counter, hesitating as a familiar unease crept in again. Late-night meetings, her sudden interest in yoga classes, it didn't sit right. Their messages had dwindled lately, and when she did text, it felt distant and cold. Shaking his head, he pocketed his phone, deciding this wasn't the time. He'd talk to her later. Stepping out into the sunlight, the scent of chlorine filled the air. Jaden, his pride and joy, was at the edge of the pool chatting with his best friend Connor. The two had been inseparable for years, and Anthony had come to see Connor as a second son. He felt Connor was a good influence, keeping Jaden grounded. Or at least he had always thought so. Without warning, the boys leapt into the pool, sending a splash over the patio. "Cannonballs!" Jaden shouted, his laughter echoing as he surfaced, his wet hair clinging to his face. Madeline laughed from behind the bar, her eyes twinkling as she watched. When Connor climbed out of the water, she handed him a drink, her hand brushing his arm. The touch was fleeting, innocent enough, yet Anthony noticed. His smile faded for just a second as he caught Connor's lingering glance at Madeline. He muttered something that made her laugh, and Anthony's stomach tightened. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the way they looked at each other, the ease of her laughter around Connor, had felt off. Anthony stood frozen, watching as Madeline passed another drink to Connor, her laugh ringing out, bright but somehow strained. Or was he imagining it? Jaden climbed out of the pool, oblivious to the tension, and grabbed a towel. "Dad, you coming in?" he asked, tossing the towel over his shoulder. "Maybe later, buddy." "Just watching for now," Anthony replied, forcing a smile. Jaden shrugged and returned to the pool, but Anthony's attention remained on Madeline and Connor. Madeline was facing the pool, but he saw the faint smile on her lips as Connor leaned in to talk. They were standing too close. Connor's hand brushed hers again, too casually, and Anthony's throat tightened. Maybe he was reading too much into it, letting his mind play tricks. Connor had been coming to their home for years, and Madeline had practically watched him grow up. There was nothing to worry about, he told himself, but the gnawing feeling in his stomach wouldn't go away. Clearing his throat, he stepped closer to them, breaking into their conversation. "Looks like you two are having a good time," he said, keeping his voice light but laced with a hint of tension. Madeline turned toward him, her smile steady. "Just chatting," she replied. "Connor was telling me about his new job at the gym. He's thinking of becoming a personal trainer." Anthony nodded, not taking his eyes off her. "That's great. Sounds like you're keeping busy, Connor." "Yeah, man, just figuring things out," Connor said, flashing his usual easy grin. "Your wife's been super supportive. She's given me a lot of advice." Anthony's gaze shifted back to Madeline, catching the slight change in her expression. Her smile seemed just a bit too tight. "Just helping where I can," she said softly, taking a sip of her drink. Anthony nodded, his mind racing with questions he didn't dare ask. Not here, not now. He forced himself to stay calm, though tension simmered just beneath the surface. He stood there, watching, feeling like an outsider in his own home. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn, and he hadn't noticed it happening. "I'm going to grab a beer," he muttered, heading toward the cooler. As he bent down, he caught a snippet of their conversation. Their voices were low, but not low enough. "I'll see you later," Connor said. "Yeah, just text me," Madeline replied, her tone casual but with a familiarity that sent a chill down Anthony's spine. He straightened up, beer in hand, and looked at them. Madeline met his gaze, her expression unreadable for a moment before she flashed that same bright smile, one that now made his stomach churn. Later that evening, after the boys left and the house was quiet, he couldn't shake the feeling that had haunted him all day. Sitting at the kitchen table, he stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over Madeline's recent messages. He knew he shouldn't look, he trusted her. They'd been married for 20 years. She wouldn't betray him, not Madeline. But the way Connor had looked at her, the way her laughter seemed forced, it gnawed at him. Unable to resist, he tapped the screen, opening her messages. At first they seemed innocent, but as he scrolled, his heart dropped. Meet you after yoga, same time as last week. I can't wait. I've missed you. His hands started to tremble. Those words weren't meant for him, they were from Connor. Anthony gaped at the screen, his heart hammering so loudly in his chest that it seemed to drown out everything else around him. His breathing grew rapid, his entire focus drawn to that single conversation thread. There it was, the confirmation he dreaded yet somehow anticipated. Madeline was having an affair with Connor, his son's closest friend. He sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him, as echoes of the day's earlier laughter taunted him. Suddenly, everything clicked: the late nights, the excuses, the distant gaze she'd worn. Anthony had always trusted her, but that trust had now shattered, replaced by a simmering anger just beneath the surface. He rose slowly, still clutching his phone, feeling his world begin to disintegrate, yet he resolved not to let it crumble without a fight. Not yet. The weeks that followed that afternoon by the pool blurred together for Anthony, his suspicions embedding themselves deeply, festering. He couldn't shake the vision of Madeline and Connor standing too close, whispering in that familiar way. Since then, Madeline had grown distant, the playful touches, the teasing exchanges, they had all faded, leaving interactions that felt forced and mechanical. One evening, as Anthony pretended to read the newspaper in the living room, though the words blurred before him, Madeline passed by, adjusting her earrings and grabbing her purse. She wore that calculatedly casual demeanor. "I have a late meeting tonight," she muttered, avoiding his gaze, her back turned as she fiddled with her phone. "Another one?" Anthony inquired, masking his irritation as best as he could. He glanced at the clock. It was nearing 9 p.m. "It's pretty late for a meeting," he added. Madeline turned with a tense smile. "Yeah, last-minute prep for some big presentations." "Don't wait up," she leaned in, brushing a barely there kiss on his cheek, before heading for the door. As she left, Anthony watched, his mind spinning. When he heard the door click shut, something inside him snapped. He grabbed his car keys, threw on his jacket, and left the house, determined to discover the truth. Anthony parked a few blocks away from home, his heart thumping hard enough to feel it in his throat. The quiet streets were lined with trees, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. Fixing his gaze on the rearview mirror, he watched Madeline's car, and as he suspected, she didn't head to the office. Instead, she drove back toward their neighborhood. He followed at a distance, until he saw her pull into their driveway. A wave of disbelief washed over him. She wasn't supposed to be here. Frozen in his car, Anthony's mind whirled with possibilities. He knew why, yet he fought to deny it. Gripping the steering wheel, he took a steadying breath, then exited the car, his movements silent as he crept toward the house, keeping to the shadows. His pulse roared in his ears as he edged along the side, heading for the back where he knew the bedroom window would be. The house was cloaked in darkness, but a faint glow seeped from their upstairs bedroom. Swallowing dryly, he moved onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath him. He had a sickening sense of what he'd find, but he needed to see it. The back door was unlocked, as Madeline often forgot to secure it. Anthony paused, hand on the handle, briefly considering walking away, pretending he didn't know. But that wasn't him, he needed to face it. Slipping inside quietly, he moved with purpose, his eyes adjusting to the dim surroundings as he crept down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last, drawing him closer to the dreaded truth. At the base of the stairs, he caught a low murmur of voices. His heart clenched as he began ascending, each stair groaning beneath his weight like a scream. The voices became clearer as he neared the top, with thoughts he didn't want to confront racing through his mind. When he reached the landing, he saw their bedroom door slightly ajar, muffling the intimate conversation within. He stopped just outside, his hand trembling as he reached out, caught between confronting reality and retreating. Yet, he nudged the door open just enough to peer inside, and there they were, Madeline and Connor, entwined in each other, moving together as if they were the only ones in the world. Connor's hands traced her body, his lips pressed against her neck, and Madeline moaned softly, completely enraptured. Anthony's world shattered at that moment, his stomach churning and chest tightening. The woman he had loved for 20 years lay with his son's best friend. Rage surged through him, fists clenching as he fought the urge to storm in, to scream, to demand answers. But instead, he stood frozen, unable to look away, his body defying the furious command of his mind to act. The scene unfolded like a nightmare he couldn't escape. Connor's voice broke the silence. "You're incredible," he murmured, his lips brushing Madeline's ear. She giggled, pulling him closer. Anthony's stomach turned, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. As he took a step back, his foot caught on the floor, making a slight sound. He froze, breathless, but they remained oblivious, too engrossed in each other. Without a word, Anthony turned and walked away, leaving the nightmare behind. As he made his way down the stairs, Anthony felt as if his legs were weighed down by lead, moving mechanically, barely aware of his surroundings. His mind was blank, his body acting purely on instinct, out of the house and into the night. His car, parked a few blocks away, awaited him. He climbed in, slamming the door shut but not starting the engine. He sat there in the darkness, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened, haunted by the image of them together, a scar he knew would never heal. Madeline's laughter, her moans, Connor's hands on her, replayed in his mind like a relentless nightmare. His breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of what he'd witnessed settled over him, heavy as a suffocating blanket. 20 years, 2 decades of loyalty and love, ending not with a fight or an argument, but with quiet betrayal in the bed they had shared. Anthony rested his forehead against the steering wheel, his body shaking with a mix of anger and sorrow. Tears stung his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. After what seemed like hours, he finally started the car and drove away from the house, leaving behind the life he once knew. His mind raced, thoughts colliding as he processed what he had just witnessed. There was no return now he had seen the truth. Madeline's betrayal laid bare. Everything would change. The dark, empty road stretched ahead, much like the uncertain future awaiting him. He didn't know where he was headed, but one thing was clear: going back wasn't an option anymore. That night, Anthony didn't confront them. Though his heart had been shattered, he realized that storming into the room and demanding answers wouldn't undo what had happened. His marriage, his family, his life as he knew it was finished. Nothing remained to be saved. So he made a decision. The following morning, Anthony rose early, long before dawn. The house was silent, Madeline still asleep, oblivious to the fact he had spent the entire night outside in his car, trying to decide his next step. Now he had a clear plan. Moving quietly, he began to pack a bag, navigating the house like it was no longer his own. He took only the essentials: clothes, his wallet, and his phone. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. He wouldn't leave a note or offer an explanation. She would figure it out on her own. As he zipped his suitcase, he heard a faint sound upstairs, perhaps Madeline stirring. He paused, but when silence returned, he continued. It struck him as odd how easy it felt to leave after 2 decades of marriage. He thought walking out would be harder, but it wasn't. In fact, it felt like the only thing he could do. Once packed, Anthony took his car keys and stood by the front door, his hand resting on the knob. His thoughts drifted to Jaden, his son, the one person he hated to leave behind. Anthony knew Jaden wouldn't understand why he left, not initially. But the idea of explaining, of revealing the truth about his mother, was unbearable. Jaden would have to despise him, and Anthony could accept that. Without another look at the house he once called home, he opened the door and stepped outside. The cool, still morning air greeted him as he softly closed the door, as if leaving behind a life that no longer existed. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away, not glancing back. Word of Anthony's sudden disappearance soon spread through their small town. Madeline played her role flawlessly, acting heartbroken, telling neighbors and friends that Anthony had left her. She cried before Jaden, putting on a convincing show, all while knowing the real reason he was gone. For weeks, Madeline evaded questions from concerned friends. "Do you think he left you for someone else?" a friend asked her over coffee one afternoon. "I mean, no one just vanishes for no reason." "I don't know," Madeline replied, her voice shaky with feigned sorrow. Maybe he wasn't happy. Maybe there was someone else. She dabbed at a tear, maintaining the appearance of a wounded wife flawlessly. No one suspected a thing. Meanwhile, Jaden was livid, unable to believe his father had simply abandoned them. "He didn't even say goodbye," Jaden raged to Madeline one evening. "It's like he didn't care about us at all." Madeline wrapped her arms around him, her face a picture of concern, though inwardly, she felt relieved that Anthony was out of the picture. "Maybe your father was unhappy," she murmured, gently running her fingers through Jaden's hair. "Sometimes people leave because they don't know how to face their problems, but to vanish like that. It's messed up." Mom, Jaden fumed, pacing the room. "He probably ran off with someone else. Why else would he just leave?" Madeline didn't respond, letting him believe what he wanted. As the months went by, Anthony faded from people's minds. He hadn't just left town, he had vanished without a trace. He withdrew money from his accounts before leaving, deleted his social media, and changed his number, cutting all ties to ensure no one could track him. He rented a small, secluded cabin in the mountains, far from anyone who knew him, a remote, isolated place perfect for starting over. The days were slow at first as Anthony adapted to his new life of solitude. He spent long hours hiking in the surrounding woods, hoping to clear his mind, but the betrayal lingered like a shadow, and the image of Madeline and Connor haunted him. Despite the pain, a part of him felt liberated, free from a loveless marriage, no longer pretending everything was fine. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone now. He was finally free. Anthony found work at a local hardware store, blending into the background as just another anonymous figure in a small town. The locals didn't pry into his past, they saw a quiet man who kept to himself, and that was enough for them. However, even as years passed, a simmering anger remained within him. He thought of Jayden often, wondering how his son was managing in his absence, but he knew returning was impossible. Madeline and Connor would continue their sordid affair, believing they'd gotten away with it, but Anthony trusted that their time would come. 3 years later, Madeline's life began unraveling in ways she hadn't anticipated after Anthony's abrupt departure, leaving her to pick up the pieces, though it wasn't as easy as she had expected. The family home, once filled with laughter and memories, had become a burden. Eventually, she sold it, convincing herself that a fresh start with Connor would solve her problems. Connor, who was half her age, had become more than just a lover, he was her obsession. His youthful charm, his knack for saying just the right thing to make her feel special, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But that charm came at a cost. Slowly, Connor had persuaded Madeline to hand over most of her money, convincing her it was needed for his business ventures and that their future depended on it. Blinded by love, or perhaps guilt, she complied. By the time she realized how much she'd given away, it was too late. Connor had started to drift, showing up less and less, leaving Madeline to face the consequences of her choices. Her once stable life had turned into a cycle of financial stress and emotional turmoil, with the affair that once seemed thrilling now reduced to a tragic mess. Now, she clung to the faint hope that Connor still cared, but deep down, she knew he didn't. Meanwhile, as Madeline's life spiraled out of control, Anthony had rebuilt his life from scratch. Across the state, he had settled into a new routine with quiet resolve. For 3 years, he had lived in peace, biding his time, planning and waiting. His disappearance had allowed him the freedom to start anew, but he hadn't completely left the past behind. Those years were spent plotting his revenge, every step carefully thought out. Walking away wasn't enough. Madeline had betrayed him, and Connor had taken everything: his family, his pride. They would pay for what they had done, and Anthony had a plan. He was patient, knowing that his moment would come. He just had to wait. It was a chilly, gray afternoon when Anthony heard a knock at his door. He hadn't expected anyone and briefly wondered if it was a mistake. But when he opened the door, he saw Jayden standing there, his face flushed with anger. "Dad, you ruined everything," Jayden shouted, pushing past him into the small living room without an invitation. Anthony stepped back, watching his son storm inside. He hadn't seen Jayden in 3 years, and in that time his son had become harder, angrier. But Anthony didn't feel the warmth he might have felt before. Instead, he kept his expression cool and distant. Jayden turned, eyes blazing. "Mom's in the hospital," he spat, his voice quivering with a mix of fury and desperation. "She was in a car accident, and she needs your blood to survive. You're the only match. If you don't help her, she'll die." Anthony's heart twisted at the news, but he kept his calm. "She's in the hospital." He looked at his son, absorbing the words. The man he once was, the one who had loved Madeline and built a life with her, might have rushed to her side, might have felt pity or concern. But that man was gone. "Yeah, a car accident," Jayden replied, his voice shaking with frustration. "Her blood type is rare, and you're the only one who can help. This is your chance to make things right, to fix this." Anthony's voice was cold and flat. "What do you want from me?" Jayden stepped closer, his fists clenched. "I want you to do the right thing," he shouted. "She's your wife, you can't just walk away from this. You need to help her." Anthony took a slow breath, his expression unchanging. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jayden," he said quietly, "but I'm not coming back." Jayden's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're really going to let her die? What kind of father does that?" Anthony gripped the phone tightly, taking another breath before speaking. "I'm not the one who abandoned this family, Jayden. Your mother made her choices, and now she's facing the consequences." Jayden looked at him, bewildered. "What are you talking about?" Anthony stayed calm, his expression unreadable. He reached into a drawer, pulling out a small flash drive and holding it out to Jayden with a steady hand. "What's this?" Jayden asked, staring at the drive without taking it. Anthony's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "A little video," he said quietly. "It's of your best friend Connor and your mother together. Maybe he can donate his blood. As for me, I'm done with all of you. May she rest in peace." For a moment, Jayden didn't move, the room falling into a tense silence as he absorbed his father's words. His hand shook as he finally reached out, taking the flash drive with wide, disbelieving eyes. "What? What are you saying?" he stammered, his voice unsteady. "You heard me," Anthony replied, his tone icy. "Your mother and Connor have been involved for years. You just didn't know." Jayden's face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for words that wouldn't come. He looked down at the flash drive in his hand, then back at his father, his eyes a mix of confusion and horror. "You're lying," Jayden whispered, but the doubt was there, unmistakable. Anthony folded his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Check the video if you don't believe me," he said, his voice firm. "You'll see for yourself." Jayden took a shaky step back, clutching the flash drive like it was evidence that could shatter his world. He stared at his father, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. "You knew this whole time?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew and said nothing." Anthony shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I didn't owe anyone an explanation, not after what they did." Tears of frustration welled in Jayden's eyes as he tried to make sense of everything. His anger, once so fierce, was crumbling under the weight of the truth. He had been certain his father was the villain, convinced Anthony had left without reason. But now, his legs gave out, and he sank onto the edge of the couch, his head in his hands. The flash drive lay beside him, untouched, but its presence loomed over him, suffocating. The reality of his mother's actions, of Connor's betrayal, was slowly crushing him. Anthony watched his son, feeling a twinge of something, perhaps regret or sorrow, but it was fleeting. He had done what needed to be done. This was the moment he had waited for. "You can still leave," Jayden, Anthony said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "Walk away before this destroys you too, just like it destroyed me." Jayden lifted his tear-streaked face, full of anguish. "How could you just disappear?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How could you leave me, with him?" Anthony didn't flinch. "I had to. Staying would have destroyed me, and I couldn't drag you into it." "You wouldn't have understood." Jayden looked at his father, the weight of everything pressing on him like a heavy blanket. After a long, painful pause, he stood, clutching the flash drive tightly. "I'm going to the hospital," he said hoarsely. "I have to see Mom." Anthony nodded, stepping aside as Jayden headed for the door. As his son opened it and stepped out into the cold, Anthony called after him. "Remember what I said, Jayden. You don't owe anyone anything, not anymore." Jayden paused for a moment, then walked out without a word, the door closing softly behind him. Anthony stood in the quiet, gazing at the door for a long moment. Then finally he turned and went back into the kitchen, feeling the weight of 3 years lift from his shoulders. The steady hum of hospital machines filled the room, broken only by the occasional beep of the heart monitor. Madeline lay on the bed, pale and unconscious, her face drained under the harsh fluorescent lights. The doctors had done all they could. It was now up to her body to fight. Jayden hurried into the hospital, his shoes squeaking against the polished floor as he brushed past nurses, barely registering their worried glances. His heart was racing, his mind swirling, and the weight of the flash drive in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with every step. He burst into his mother's room, breathless and shaking, only to find her lying still, tubes attached to her arms, a ventilator breathing for her. Jayden hadn't fully processed what his father had revealed: Connor, his best friend. The thought twisted his stomach. Connor had been someone he admired, someone he trusted completely. They had shared secrets and grown up together. Now that trust was shattered beyond repair. He hadn't yet had the nerve to watch the video on the flash drive, but knowing what it contained was enough to make him feel ill. His father's cold words echoed in his mind: "Your best friend Connor doing your mother from the back." Jayden stood by his mother's bedside, looking down at her, and whispered, his voice barely audible, "How could you? How could you do this to us?" He was torn between anger and sorrow. For years he had believed that his father had destroyed their family, had abandoned them without explanation, leaving them to fend for themselves. But now, with the truth revealed, everything felt upside down. His father had been wronged, while his mother had hidden the most painful betrayal. Suddenly, a voice spoke behind him, She won't make it without a blood transfusion turning. Jayden saw a doctor in the doorway, a clipboard in hand, his face somber. "What do you mean?" Jayden asked, his voice unsteady. "She's lost a significant amount of blood," the doctor explained. "She needs a direct transfusion from a close match. You're not compatible, but your father is." Jayden clenched his fists, the situation's harsh reality sinking in. He needed his father's help, but after what Anthony had said, he knew it was hopeless. His father had already made it clear he was finished with them. "Is there no other way?" Jayden asked, desperation seeping into his voice. The doctor shook his head. "I'm sorry, but we've tried everything. Without his help, there's nothing more we can do." Jayden's chest tightened as he stood there, grappling with the loss of the life he had believed in, realizing that his best friend had betrayed him, his mother had lied, and his father had been justified in leaving. Now, with the looming threat of losing her, he didn't know what to do. Across town, Anthony sat in his quiet living room, the television on but muted, his mind far from the screen. His thoughts were back at the hospital with Jayden's devastated face and the request he had denied without a second thought. Years of planning his revenge, waiting for the right moment to free himself from the chaos Madeline had brought into their lives, had led to this. The flash drive had been symbolic, a final gift to Jayden. Anthony knew his son would never look at his mother the same way again. The truth was destructive, and he had no doubt that the video would complete what Madeline and Connor had started. Yet, sitting here now, Anthony felt empty. He had anticipated satisfaction, closure, but there was only a hollow feeling. His phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it at first, but it continued, insistent. With a sigh, he picked it up, seeing Jayden's name on the screen. He hesitated, then answered. "Dad." Jayden's voice was raw, strained. "Please, you have to come to the hospital. Mom's dying. She needs your blood." Anthony closed his eyes, the words sinking in. He had heard them before and still felt nothing. "I told you, Jayden. I'm done." There was a pause, and he could hear Jayden's breath catch. "She's still my mom, Dad," Jayden said, his voice cracking. "I know what she did was terrible. I know everything now, okay? But she's still my mom. I can't just sit here and watch her die." Anthony's hand tightened around the phone, feeling a flicker of something pity, perhaps stir within him. "You don't owe her anything, Jayden," he said, his voice cold. "She made her choices, and now she has to live with them. Or die because of them," Jayden retorted, his tone sharp. "Is that what you want? For her to die knowing you could have saved her?" Anthony remained silent, weighed down by the question. He didn't respond, and after a long pause, Jayden let out a frustrated sigh. "You said you were done with all of us. Fine. But what about me? I'm your son. Don't I matter?" Anthony felt a pang in his chest, the words hitting him harder than he'd anticipated. For a moment, he nearly reconsidered. But then he remembered walking in on Madeline and Connor, the lies, the betrayal. This was how it had to end. "I'm sorry," Jayden, Anthony said quietly, "but I'm not coming." The line went silent. Part of Anthony expected Jayden to lash out, to scream at him for abandoning them again. Instead, there was only the sound of Jayden's uneven breathing. "Goodbye, Dad," Jayden finally said, his voice flat and resigned, and then the line went dead. Back at the hospital, Jayden stared at his phone, his hands shaking. He had known deep down that his father wouldn't come, but he had held on to a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, Anthony would save her. But that hope was gone now, crushed under the weight of his father's refusal. He looked at his mother, her chest rising and falling in time with the ventilator. Her face looked peaceful, almost serene, but Jayden knew that beneath the stillness lay the ruins of her life. She had made choices, terrible ones, that had torn their family apart, and now she was paying the ultimate price. Jayden understood that Connor had left her. He knew that much now. After all her money had dried up and the love had faded, Connor had moved on to someone younger, wealthier. Desperate to keep him, Madeline had held on too tightly. The car accident hadn't been an accident, it was Connor's final way of casting her aside. Tears blurred Jayden's vision as he sank into the chair beside her bed. He was furious, angrier than he had ever been, but there was also a deep sadness consuming him. This was the end, there was no going back. He could either hold on to the bitterness or let it go. He wasn't sure which would be worse. As the minutes ticked by, Jayden sat in silence, his mind swirling. His father was gone, his mother was dying, and Connor, the friend he had once trusted, had betrayed them all. There was nothing left. With a heavy heart, Jayden reached out and took his mother's hand, holding it gently. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but it didn't matter. "I forgive you," he whispered, his voice shaky. "I don't understand why you did it. I don't think I ever will. But I forgive you." And with that, Jayden let his tears fall. The call came in the dead of night. Anthony was sitting at his kitchen table, staring into the darkness, when the familiar vibration of his phone broke the silence. Without much thought, he picked it up, his thumb hesitating briefly before answering. "Hello, Dad." Jayden's voice was barely a whisper, and Anthony immediately recognized the sorrow in his son's tone. It was over. "She's gone," Jayden said, the words hanging heavily between them, final and unchangeable. Anthony closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He felt no joy, no triumph, only emptiness. When he spoke, though he wasn't sure why, he asked, "When?" "About an hour ago," Jayden replied, his voice breaking. "On the operating table." "They couldn't save her." Anthony stood, the chair scraping across the floor behind him, and paced the length of the kitchen, his grip tightening around the phone. The thought of Madeline, the woman he had once loved, lying lifeless on a cold hospital table should have hurt more. But after everything, the betrayal, the years of silence, it just felt like an inevitability. Jayden was quiet for a moment, as if trying to gather his thoughts. I didn't know, Dad," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "About Connor, about all of it. I didn't want to know." Anthony paused in his pacing, his grip on the phone relaxing a bit. He could hear the pain in Jayden's voice, the weight of guilt pressing down on him. For years, Jayden had been convinced that his father was the one who'd abandoned them, the one who broke their family. Now he knew the truth, and it was worse than he could have ever imagined. "You were just a kid," Jayden, Anthony said softly, leaning against the kitchen counter. "You weren't supposed to know. That was between your mother and me, but I should have seen it," Jayden insisted, his voice shaky. "I should have known something was off. I trusted him, Dad. I trusted Connor." Anthony felt a pang in his chest at the mention of Connor, the boy who had grown up in their home, shared meals with them, laughed with their family, only to betray them in the worst way. Anthony had spent years wrestling with that betrayal, letting it fester inside until it consumed him, but Jayden was only just starting to understand its full weight. "It's not your fault," Anthony said firmly. "Connor took advantage of the situation, of your mother, of all of us." Jayden's breath hitched on the other end of the line. "I don't know how to forgive her, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can." Anthony closed his eyes, rubbing his face. Forgiveness was something he'd grappled with for years. He'd never been able to forgive Madeline, not for the affair, not for the lies, not for tearing apart everything they had built. But now, standing in the aftermath, he realized forgiveness wasn't something he needed to offer her, it was something Jayden had to find within himself. "You don't have to forgive her," Anthony said quietly. "Not right away, maybe not ever. But clinging to the anger won't change what happened. It won't bring her back, and it won't heal the damage." Silence filled the line as Jayden tried to hold himself together. Anthony wanted to say more, to offer something that would ease the pain, but he knew nothing could. The wound was too deep. "I'm sorry," Jayden whispered, his voice choked. "For everything, for blaming you, for not seeing the truth." Anthony's chest tightened, and he swallowed hard. "You don't have to be sorry, Jayden. You did what you thought was right. Now you know, that's what matters." There was another pause, and Anthony could faintly hear footsteps in the background. Jayden was probably pacing, like he used to when he was a child, sorting through his emotions the only way he knew how. "I don't know what to do now," Jayden admitted, his voice small and vulnerable. "She's gone. Connor's gone too. It feels like I've lost everything." Anthony leaned against the counter, staring into the darkness outside. He had felt that same emptiness once, after the night he walked away from his family, disappearing without a trace. The loss, the betrayal, it had almost destroyed him. But now, after years spent piecing his life back together, he realized something he hadn't before. "You haven't lost everything," Anthony said gently. "You still have yourself, Jayden, and you still have me. We'll figure this out together." Jayden's voice was barely above a whisper when he responded, "You mean that?" "Yeah," Anthony replied, nodding even though Jayden couldn't see. "I mean it." A long silence followed, and Anthony could almost picture Jayden standing there, trying to process everything: the loss of his mother, the betrayal of his best friend, the guilt, and the anger. It was a heavy burden for anyone to carry, but Jayden didn't have to carry it alone. "What do we do now?" Jayden asked hesitantly. Anthony took a deep breath, slowly exhaling as he glanced around his quiet, empty kitchen. He didn't have all the answers, not even close, but for the first time in years he felt there was a path forward, not just for himself but for Jayden too. We move on, Anthony said simply. One day at a time, the funeral was a small, somber gathering. Madeline's casket was closed, her once vibrant presence reduced to a memory. Jayden stood by the grave, his hands clenched into fists, tears streaming silently down his cheeks. Anthony stood beside him, his face expressionless, but his eyes heavy with unspoken emotion. The pastor spoke words of comfort, but they felt empty, lost in the enormity of what had happened. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Jayden took a step closer, his body shaking with the weight of his sorrow. Anthony placed a hand on his son's shoulder, offering silent support. "I can't believe she's gone," Jayden whispered, his voice barely audible. Anthony nodded, gazing at the freshly turned earth covering Madeline's body. "Neither can I." They stood there in silence, watching as the last handfuls of dirt were thrown onto the grave. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes of what had once been. "I thought I hated her," Jayden confessed, his voice cracking. "But I didn't. I don't know." Anthony squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "It's okay not to know, Jayden. It's okay to feel everything, even if it doesn't make sense." They remained there for what felt like hours, side by side, allowing the silence to fill the space between them. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't closure, but it was something, a beginning, perhaps, or at least the possibility of one. As they turned to leave the cemetery, Jayden glanced at his father, his face still wet with tears. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" Anthony looked at his son, the boy who had grown into a man through all the pain and loss. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we'll figure it out together," and with that, they walked away, leaving the past behind as best they could. Months had gone by since Madeline's death, since the truth of her betrayal had surfaced, and since Anthony had given Jayden the flash drive that shattered the last remnants of his son's innocence. The dark cloud that had hung over Anthony's life for so long had finally started to dissipate, though it left scars. Anthony stood in his new apartment, sipping coffee as the morning sun filtered through large windows. It was a modest place, a far cry from the home he had shared with Madeline, but it was his own. He had chosen this life, this solitude, and found comfort in its simplicity. The silence that had once felt stifling now offered a sense of freedom he hadn't known in years. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at it and saw a message from Brooklyn Coffee. Later, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Brooklyn, a woman who had come into his life unexpectedly, with a quiet strength that had anchored him when he needed it most. They had met through mutual friends, both carrying the scars of betrayal, both cautious about trusting again. But over the months, their bond had grown, built on shared experiences and a gradual, steady understanding of each other's pain. "See you at 2, he typed back, setting the phone aside. Just as he did, a knock sounded at the door, making Anthony's heart jump slightly. He wasn't expecting anyone. Moving to the door, he half expected it to be a neighbor, or perhaps a delivery. But when he opened it, Jayden was standing there. "Hey," Jayden said, shifting uncomfortably. "Hey," Anthony replied, surprised. "Come in." Jayden stepped into the apartment, looking around as if trying to get a sense of this new place his father called home. It was the first time they had seen each other since the funeral. In the months between, there had been occasional texts and calls, but nothing deep. There had been too much distance for too long. "You want some coffee?" Anthony offered, motioning to the half-full pot on the counter. "Yeah, sure," Jayden replied, following him into the small kitchen. He pulled out a chair and sat at the table, watching as Anthony poured him a cup. Anthony handed him the coffee and sat across from him. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It held the weight of unspoken words, things they both wanted to say but weren't sure how to begin. "How have you been?" Jayden asked finally, his voice cautious. Anthony shrugged. "I'm getting by. How about you?" Jayden looked down into his coffee, stirring it absently. "I'm trying," he admitted. "It's been tough, you know. Losing Mom, finding out everything. It's like my whole world turned upside down." Anthony nodded, understanding all too well. "It's not easy, Jayden, but you're stronger than you realize." Jayden took a sip of his coffee, his hands trembling slightly as he set the mug back down. "I've thought a lot about everything that happened, about how I blamed you for leaving. I was so angry at you, Dad. I thought you'd just walked out on us, on me, and I didn't understand why." Anthony's expression softened as he looked at his son. "I didn't want to hurt you, Jayden. That's why I left. I thought if I stayed, everything would get worse. I couldn't live with what your mom had done, and I didn't want to drag you through it. Leaving felt like the best thing I could do for you." Jayden swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand that now. I just wish I'd known sooner." Anthony reached across the table, placing a hand on Jayden's arm. "We can't change the past, but we can try to move forward. That's what matters now." Jayden nodded, though he still felt a heavy sense of guilt. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom, about Connor, about everything. I don't know if I can ever forgive them for what they did, but I don't want to live with this anger anymore. It's exhausting." Anthony leaned back in his chair, fully understanding. "Forgiveness isn't for them, Jayden. It's for you. It doesn't mean what they did was okay, it just means you're not letting it control you anymore." Jayden looked up at his father, taking in those words. "Is that what you did? Forgive Mom." Anthony was quiet for a moment, looking down at his coffee. "I don't know if I ever fully forgave her," he admitted, "but I stopped letting her betrayal define me. I moved on, and that's enough." Jayden took in his father's words, realizing there was still a lot of healing to do. But for the first time he felt that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what they had lost. "Have you met someone?" Jayden asked suddenly, catching Anthony off guard. Anthony hesitated, then smiled softly. "Yes, her name's Brooklyn. She's been through her own struggles, kind of like us, but we're taking things slowly." Jayden offered a faint smile. "That's good, Dad. I'm glad." A sense of relief filled the room, as if they had finally reached a point where they could breathe again. The past was still there, but it no longer cast the same dark shadow. It was something they'd have to live with, but it didn't need to define them. "What about you?" Anthony asked. "How are you holding up?" Jayden shrugged, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I'm working on it. I'm seeing a therapist, trying to make sense of everything. It's helping, little by little." Anthony nodded, feeling a surge of pride for his son. Jayden had been through so much, yet here he was, working to put his life back together. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee before Jayden spoke again. "Do you ever think about her?" he asked softly. "About Mom?" Anthony took a deep breath, letting the question settle. "Sometimes," he admitted. "It's hard not to. She was a big part of my life for a long time. But I don't dwell on it anymore. I've learned to let go." Jayden looked distant as he nodded. "I don't know if I'll ever stop thinking about her, but I guess that's okay. She was my mom, after all." Anthony smiled gently. "It's okay to miss her, Jayden. No matter what she did, she was still your mother. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel." Jayden looked at his father, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Dad." Anthony reached out and gave his son's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We're going to be okay, Jayden. It's going to take time, but we'll get there." Later that afternoon, as Jayden left the apartment, Anthony stood at the door, watching him go. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, Anthony felt they were on the right path. Later that day, Anthony met Brooklyn for coffee at their favorite spot. They sat together, talking about everything and nothing, enjoying the simple pleasure of each other's company. For Anthony, it was a fresh start, a chance to rebuild, not only with Brooklyn but also with Jayden and with himself. As he looked across the table at Brooklyn, her eyes warm and filled with understanding, he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, life had given him a second chance. This time he wouldn't waste it. He had finally found peace,